The war in Ukraine continues to intensify continuously on all front lines. The breaking moments of the clashes began with the Ukrainian advance in Zaporizhia after the Ukrainians liberated many settlements in this region. The offensive dispersed its axis in two different directions. One of these directions was the southern front line, which included Kherson. The other direction was the critical front line from Zaporizhia to Donetsk and Luhansk. When the clashes in Zaporizhia fell, this time, the Donetsk front line became active. The Ukrainians started preparations for serious military actions in the city of Bakhmut, Donetsk region, currently in the direction of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian defense forces hold the initiative. Russian and Ukrainian forces continue their ground attacks in and around Bakhmut. The Ukrainian General Staff reported relatively larger numbers of Russian offensive operations near Bakhmut compared to the past few days. Ukrainian forces continue their regular offensive actions, pushing back the Russian troops. Ukrainian forces penetrated the Russian defense at Bakhmut. Of course, all this was due to the problems the Wagner Group had with Russia. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that units of the southern group of forces repelled Ukrainian attacks in the northwest and southwest of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces completely routed the 57th Motor Rifle Brigade in the Bakhmut area. The withdrawal of Wagner forces from Bakhmut and the fact that their mercenaries were no longer as effective on the battlefield gave the Ukrainians a serious advantage in the Donetsk region, especially around the city of Bakhmut. But the Ukrainian forces did not hesitate to seize this advantage, not only in the harsh steppes of Bakhmut but also much further to the northeast of Donetsk. Ukrainians destroyed a Russian bridgehead in an unspecified area on the western bank of the Seversky-Donetsk-Donbas Canal. The Russians were using the bridgehead for important military logistic activities. With the Ukrainian capture of Verkhovka, the Russians had already predicted that the Ukrainian troops would form a heavy offensive corridor up to Seversky. Thus, the destruction of the Seversk bridge facilitated the Ukrainian creation of the link road from Donetsk to Lugansk and Kiev's grand offensive plans. As the Russians can no longer benefit from its connecting bridge, we may witness the Ukrainian troops attacking the front lines around Seversk and this region for a long time. In fact, this destroyed bridge in Seversk is expected to provide many different advantages for the Ukrainians. One of the major offensive plans of the Ukrainian armed forces is to establish dominance in Luhansk, as well as regions such as Zaporizhia and Donetsk to the northwest of Seversk, which is the Kremlin region. Ukrainian troops close to Seversky are planning to squeeze the Russians, with the bridgehead here becoming unusable since the Russians will not be able to provide support to the Luhansk-Crimea front line from Seversk. Putin's only chance is to withdraw his troops from Lysychansk to Seversk. But here too, the Ukrainian troops continue to push the Russians. Unbelievable offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces continue in Svatov, another critical front line of Luhansk. The last time the Ukrainians destroyed a UAV airbase used by the Russian troops here, Russia actually began to lose its presence in Luhansk as a result of all these attacks. The possibility of Putin sending reinforcements and ammunition from the Russian borders to the Luhansk region of Ukraine decreased because the Ukrainian troops have now created such an attack network in Luhansk that it would be complete madness for Russia to supply the military from its own borders to Luhansk. Ukrainians have special units and volunteer military groups both on the border and on almost all fronts of Luhansk. Sniper teams of the Ukrainian army are also deployed on the Luhansk and Russian border lines. In other words, if Russia takes any action in these critical areas, there are too many Ukrainian military elements to respond to it. But the soldiers that the Russians have deployed to the border lines near Luhansk and this region are actually Russian citizens mobilized voluntarily. In other words, these voluntary military units of the Russians are generally inexperienced and insufficient in clashes. So, how badly did the Ukrainians progress on the Luhansk, Donetsk, and other front lines when the situation was so bad for the Russian army? Before continuing our video, I would like to remind you, if you are against the invasion of Ukraine and wanted to support our work with my team, you can like our video, comment, and hit the super thanks button below. In the last 24 hours, the Ukrainian Defense Forces advanced from 600 meters to 1,000 meters on the southern and northern flanks around Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. However, Russia continues to reinforce Bakhmut with its airborne troops. Eastern Command spokesman Sergei Kiribas said, "This clearly shows that Moscow is trying to hold the city." Meanwhile, Tavria Military Sector Commander Brigadier General Oleksandr Tarnavsky reported that Ukrainian forces attacked Russian positions more than 1,000 times in the past day. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russian forces started 20 clashes in the east. The Russians attempted to attack in the Bakhmut, Lemon, and Marinka sectors. But Ukrainian troops also suppressed these offensive attempts and pushed the Russian trenches back by about 5 kilometers in these areas. The Kiev leader also went to see the successes of the Ukrainians on the eastern front lines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the front lines in the eastern Donetsk region, which was partially occupied by Russian forces, according to a statement from the Kiev office. Zelensky visited the military units involved in intense fighting around the city of Bakhmut and met with the soldiers resting at a gas station on the highway. While the morale of the Ukrainian army skyrocketed after this visit, on the Russian side, we see the opposite situation. Putin is not the only one weakened by the Wagner Group rebellion. Russia's war effort against Ukraine has also likely suffered. All areas have started to escalate again this week as relative normalcy has returned to the streets of Moscow. Russian troops deployed to protect the capital have stepped up security following the withdrawal of rebel Wagner Group forces. The Washington-based Institute for War Studies reported in its latest assessment that the Kremlin was struggling to provide an effective and swift response to the mercenary insurgency. In its assessment on this issue, the Institute has consistently found the Kremlin struggling to provide an effective and swift response to Wagner's advances, highlighting the impact of heavy casualties in Ukraine and the internal security weaknesses that can arise from surprise. Some Russian commentators noted that the majority of personnel deployed for internal defense were conscripts and Rosgvardia unit. Therefore, supporters of the Moscow administration have questioned why the Russian authorities decided to mobilize conscripts rather than mobilizing larger and more specialized security forces. The current critical situation between the Wagner Group and Russia is very reminiscent of the 1905 revolution, albeit in a shortened timeline, with a similar outcome after the 1905 revolution. Russian President Vladimir Putin is perhaps weaker than Nicholas. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also thinks that this problem will completely affect the course of the Russian army in Ukraine. At first glance, the prospects for the uprising in Russia seem very bleak. Wagner almost lacks the manpower or equipment of the Russian security forces. Even taking into account the important elements of the army stationed in Ukraine, Prigozhin is not yet able to command the air force for offensive effect or to defend the movement of his troops. Wagner allies such as General Sergei Surovikin wasted little time denouncing the effort, arguing that Prigozhin had few allies among the Russian elite. Moreover, the political objectives of the rebellion remain unclear. Prigozhin's complaints about the war included a full-fledged condemnation of the course of the conflict and seemed to leave little political space for continuing the war. Also, Prigozhin was careful to limit his criticism of Putin, focusing instead on lieutenants such as General Valery Gerasimov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. However, the poisonous nature of Prigozhin's words leaves the Russian president little room for reconciliation. The whole world is talking that Ukraine's victory is very close. With the latest developments, it is thought that the Ukrainian army is closer than ever to expelling Russia from its territory. The biggest reason for the South is that the aid from the U.S. to Ukraine has increased in recent days. America wants this war to come to an end and wants the heroic Ukrainian army to be victorious. For this reason, the United States of America, which increases the dose of its aid day by day, adds strength to the Ukrainian army. Thanks to the modern armored vehicles sent by the U.S., the Ukrainian army is about to change all the balances. Although there have been constant changes in the balance of power since the beginning of the war, with the latest move of the U.S., it is felt that Ukraine will hold all the power from now on. The fact that the number of states standing behind Ukraine is increasing day by day, while Russia is constantly losing allies, makes these predictions clearer. The Ukrainian army, which mobilized for a major operation with this new equipment in their hands, successfully completed every operation they planned. The biggest losses for the Russian army, which suffered damage in many regions, were the defeats in the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar. The army suffered heavy damage due to the defeats in these two cities, which are among the most important regions for the Russian army. The Russian soldiers, who suffered constant losses in a war closely followed by the whole world, began to drift into a great moral collapse. With this collapse, the damage to the Russian army, which continued to lose power, was growing day by day. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army, buoyed by the victories, is stronger than ever. These soldiers who have taken on the noble mission of saving their country are being declared heroes by the whole world. For this reason, the soldiers whose morale is very high are very close to bringing victory to their country. One of the most important operations of the Ukrainian army in recent times was the attack on the Zaporizhia region. The Ukrainian army knew that this region was strategically important for the Russian army and that there were important headquarters for Russia in the region. For this reason, the Ukrainian army, which entered the Zaporizhia region with soldiers sent from the cities of Salata and Bakhmut, ensured that the Russian soldiers in the region suffered an unforgettable defeat. In this highly publicized operation, the Ukrainian army, which attacked with 25,000 soldiers, managed to gain dominance in this region. The Russian army, on the other hand, has suffered the biggest damage since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army, which managed to seize the headquarters in Zaporizhia, is about to completely end the Russian domination in the region. The Ukrainian army completely evacuated the Russian headquarters in the region and placed its own soldiers in the SAT quarters. In this way, the Ukrainian army managed to prevent the Russian troops who were repelled from the region from re-entering the region. But Ukraine's pressure on Russia was not limited to this. Realizing how much power it holds in its hands, Ukraine has announced that it will make even greater strides after this operation. The Crimea issue, which has always been one of Ukraine's main problems, has been addressed once again. Years have passed since Crimea was unjustly occupied and annexed to Russian territory. However, the Ukrainian government still maintains that it absolutely does not accept this occupation. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, who made a statement, recently emphasized that this war will not end until Crimea is reunited with Ukraine. Despite these unequivocal statements by the Ukrainian government, which is well aware of the value of the power it has gained in recent days, Russian leader Vladimir Putin remains silent. Seeing Ukraine's growing number of allies, it is clear that Vladimir Putin has been reluctant to make harsh statements lately. However, since Crimea has been a long-standing issue between the two countries, it is expected that the fate of this region will be very difficult to determine. Both countries are willing to start major conflicts in order to gain Crimea. On the other hand, the attitude of the Crimean people also plays an important role in the situation. In this respect, Ukraine's superiority is once again clearly visible because, as it is known, the people of Crimea have never accepted Russian rule since the first days of the occupation of their region. The people of Crimea have been uprising and firmly rejecting the Russian regime and Putin's leadership. In fact, it is known that many anti-Russian organizations have been established within the borders of Crimea. The most important of these organizations, the Fire Group, is a group that works in sync with the Ukrainian army, which has caused great damage to the Russian soldiers in Crimea. On top of all this, a statement came from the UK. The UK is one of the countries that has been committed to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, both on the battlefields and politically with the help of the UK. The soldiers in the army were highly developed on many fronts. Victory was guaranteed with the latest technology weapons sent by Britain itself. For all these known reasons, the news that Britain would make a new shipment to Ukraine was met with panic by Russia. If Ukraine's alliance with the UK, which has become stronger in recent days, continues, the Russian army will have no chance. The UK, which is sending not only equipment but also soldiers to train in the Ukrainian army, is doing its best to put an end to this war. Aware of this power, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is making great efforts to break Ukraine's alliances. But despite this, Putin has not yet succeeded. While it is known that America is also giving great support to Ukraine, Putin, panicked by the step taken by Britain, could not hide his panic. Equipping Russia's strategic centers with air defense systems, Putin realized that the balance of power was completely upside down. Russia, which wants to conclude this war before things get worse, is looking for strategic areas with all its might. These operations of the Russian army continue to fail. For this reason, the Russian leader, who thinks that the devastation of the war may now begin to be experienced in his own country, is protecting the country. As a result of learning about these moves, Putin's reputation was damaged in the world press. Putin, who is now afraid of a country that he thought he could easily obtain in a few weeks, is in a very humiliated situation. Although it is known that most of the citizens on Russian soil are anti-war, Putin, who has continued this war, has been thinking about his own interests until today. But now that he has started to fall out of favor, it is a matter of curiosity whether he will want to reach a compromise in this war. It can be seen that Putin, who has been very quiet recently, has also put aside his threatening statements. This latest situation makes more analysts think that Putin may go for a compromise. However, it is not thought that such a compromise is possible due to the Crimea issue, which both countries claim that they will never compromise. On the other hand, there is a suspicion that Russia is planning new offensive plans despite the situation it finds itself in. The Russian army has so far lost more than 190,000 soldiers. The people were very angry about this situation, have taken to the streets to make their voices heard. The people who are waiting for an explanation from the Kremlin argue that Vladimir Putin must be removed from power as soon as possible. Recently, the Kiev parliament adopted the law amending certain legislative acts of Ukraine on the protection of the state border of Ukraine, which regulates the inclusion in the implementation of military units and subunits of the Ukrainian armed forces on measures to strengthen the protection of the Ukrainian state border. 310 Ukrainian deputies voted for this resolution. As a result of the voting, Kiev gave the first signals that it would take striking defensive steps on the borderline. Following these signals, the statement shared by Ukraine created a bombshell effect on the agenda. According to the law passed by the Verkhovna Rada, it will strengthen the defensive strip on its borders with Russia and Belarus. Accordingly, the Kiev administration announced that it will increase the width of the mine strip along the border of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus to 2 kilometers. The changes contained in this statement also regulated the participation of the Ukrainian armed forces, the National Guard, and the police in fulfilling the tasks of guarding the state border, and determined the place of the Ukrainian border guard in the overall system of the defense forces during martial law. In this regard, the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine noted that in practice this critical borderline will be a mine zone. In other words, Russian tanks would no longer be able to move freely on the Belarusian border because with the striking decision of the Ukrainians, there will be anti-tank mines on this borderline, which will expand 2 kilometers more. This decision, which dealt a heavy blow to Russia's attempt to endanger the Ukrainian border by opening a second front to Belarus, came as a shock to the Kremlin. The fact that the Ukrainians now play an active role at the border lines and across the border justify the concerns of the Russians in this regard. After this warm statement of the Kiev administration, while the Belarusian-Russian partnership continued to be shaken, the Kremlin administration still wanted to impose its policies of interest on Belarus. The Kremlin seemed to be using Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko as a conduit to re-engage with the information operation, presumably to negotiate favorable terms with Russia and further delay the West's supply of critical weapons systems to Ukraine. Belarusian leader Lukashenko, on the other hand, thinks that Russia is ready to take steps towards a peaceful solution and that there is a unique opportunity to end the war in Ukraine before Russia puts its economy on a stronger war footing. Lukashenko also accused the West of forcing the US and Ukrainian officials to refuse negotiations with Russia, focusing on Russia's openness to negotiations. This impeachment campaign contributed to the delay in the supply of Western tanks and other equipment necessary for Western officials to offer preemptive concessions and forcing Ukraine to negotiate on Russia's terms and possibly for the continuation of Ukrainian mechanized counterattacks. By delaying the provision of basic Western assistance, the Kremlin may be resuming the information operation through negotiations to reduce the effectiveness of future Ukrainian counterattacks and try to obtain concessions before further possible setbacks occur in Ukraine. But Belarusian public opinion is a powerful factor that distances Lukashenko from direct involvement in the war. While only 1/3 of Belarusians support Russia's war, 93% oppose the deployment of Belarusian troops to fight in Ukraine. Also, only 18% of Belarusians believe that Belarusian soldiers will fight properly rather than looking for ways to escape the war. One of the most important factors in this regard is that the Belarusian soldiers currently have very low morale due to the fact that the war in Ukraine is more reflected on their country's borders. Besides, Belarusian troops also lack combat experience and are outnumbered. Although there are about 45,000 Belarusian troops on record, More than 10,000 of them are professionally trained and relatively poorly equipped and are unlikely to even be suitable for large-scale warfare. Sending them to fight in Ukraine would leave the Belarusian president defenseless without a reliable army in Minsk to protect him. So this poses high political risks for Lukashenko. Given that the Belarusian people do not like war and that the Belarusian troops are likely to become cannon fodder, support for the Belarusian president, already below 30%, will fall even further. But in war, all odds must be taken into account. In other words, when the policy implemented by Belarus since the beginning of the war is considered, it's much clearer that the statement is true, because from the very beginning, Belarus has served as a springboard in Russia's war against Ukraine. Russian forces invaded Ukraine from Belarus, despite prior assurances from senior Belarusian officials that there would be no attack from the border. And Belarus has consistently provided logistical support, supply lines, and medical care to Russian troops. Russian military aircraft repeatedly used Belarusian airfields. In addition, Russia launched at least 800 missiles on Ukrainian territory from Belarus, according to a group of independent Belarusian observers. More than 65,000 Russian soldiers have been sent to Belarus since the beginning of the war. In addition, Belarus provided massive military assistance to the Russian forces, including tons of ammunition, a total of 100 Soviet-era tanks, mostly the M72A, and about 20 armored vehicles. More than 1,000 Russian soldiers flocked to Belarus after President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, announced that the joint regional military group would be deployed. Most of these soldiers appeared to be mobilized. Reservists trained by Belarusian senior officers. In addition, Russia transported a large number of weapons and other military equipment to Belarus. Among the units remaining in Belarus were the S-400 air defense and Iskander and Top M2 missile systems, as well as warplanes and other military aircraft, including the MiG-31 equipped with Kinzhal missiles capable of hitting targets 2,000 kilometers away. In addition to these aids, in a model similar to the one before the war, both Russia and Ukraine conducted joint military exercises in Belarus. First air and then ground operations. It was even said that Belarus and Russian troops were mixed in Ukraine to prepare for joint clashes. Belarusian authorities also summoned reservists, and the official statement for this was to update Russian military records. In fact, none of this indicated that Belarus was planning to join the war or to lend its territory for a new offensive. So an attack on Kiev from this direction seemed unlikely at the moment. But while theoretically impossible, Russian troops could attack western Ukraine from Belarus to cut off the western supply of weapons and ammunition. But with Russian soldiers trained in Belarus appearing to have gone to Donbass, the estimated 5,000 remaining will be insufficient for a new offensive. However, although Belarus's actions do not pose a great danger at the moment, Poland, which sees these events as a risk factor, has taken striking action on border security. Poland's work on these critical border lines worried both the Russians and the pro-Russian Belarusian authorities. After Russia's border line with Kaliningrad Oblast, Poland also began to strengthen its border with Belarus. In this critical period, when Russia has serious problems with the USA and other NATO member countries, it's highly unlikely that it will take a big risk and cause difficulties for the Ukrainians on the Belarusian border. Therefore, this measure taken by Poland fends off the danger situations that are expected to occur on the Belarusian-Ukrainian borderline. In short, neither Belarus nor Russia wants to confront Poland, the USA, or other NATO members at the same time. Thank you for watching us.